All right, let's spend the next few minutes to have this conversation with Dr. Andrew Nevin, who is the chief economist at PwC in Nigeria. Tuesday last week, PwC released a report talking about Nigeria's economy, the rocky road ahead. There were three scenarios. We talked about that on the program yesterday here for Nigeria for 2015 and 2016 and say what happens to the economy. Now we've got Nadine here in the studio. Good morning and thanks for coming. We appreciate your time. Talk to us overall in terms of that report, quite interesting document. In summary, what does it tell about where Nigeria goes from here, from this transition into a new administration?
Well, I think we want to start by saying, from our viewpoint, it's a good report. It's a positive story, because when we started doing our analysis, we were very concerned. Oil had gone from 110, dropping through the 70s. We started working on this, and we thought that the economy would basically stop growing. So we said we're going to look at some scenarios and trace out the implications of it. And what we found out was even in oil averaging $55 this year, the economy is going to continue to grow. So we think that's the good news out of it. But the challenge is making a transition. I mean, everyone who's watching this program and studies the economy knows that the Nigerian economy needs to make a major diversification. There have been some efforts and some progress the last few years, but it hasn't been fast enough. And I think the report highlights that needs to go much faster.
In terms of those scenarios that you were continuing, you talk about navigating these rocky roads ahead. How do you think Nigeria can navigate this? You talk about the fact that, yes, even if our crude prices go down to about 35, Nigeria can still survive the downturn. However, you talk about two scenarios. If there are political shocks, investors can leave, they could get concerned and perhaps steer away. And if we're not careful, the country could run from a positive forecast 4% to zero.
To zero, right. Well, I think the most important thing is that the country has to be organized and the policies have to work regardless of where oil price is. I mean, oil price is $65 today. It's been in the 40s. Some people think it might go lower if Iranian oil comes on. The point is not to predict the oil price. It's to be resilient across a range of oil prices. But I think what the analysis really showed us is that the fiscal structure of Nigeria is distorted. So crude oil is 90% of exports, 70% of government revenue, but it's only 11% of the economy. So essentially what we're finding out is even if oil price goes down, the private sector economy in many places can continue, but it's the government that really suffers and their shortfalls that we've seen. So that's the bad news. But what's the good news? The good news is right now Nigeria does a very poor job of collecting non-oil revenue. It only collects a little over 2% of GDP, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa the average is 16 to 17% of GDP is collected in taxes. So the one big advantage at this stage is that Nigeria has huge headroom to be able to restructure the tax system, make sure people are paying their taxes, make sure that all companies are included in that. And if that's done properly, we think we can navigate this rocky road because we can get enough tax collection to make up for it.
In terms of, I'm sure before PwC put this report together, you must have spoken to industry executives, you spoke to business leaders and tried to survey what they're thinking, what they're planning. How should the business community prepare for this rocky road ahead, as you think?
Well, I think obviously back in February and March there was a high degree of uncertainty because the election was coming up and we were really unsure of what was going to happen. A lot of that uncertainty's disappeared. We're all optimistic that we're on a good road going forward. I think from the viewpoint of business, I mean, they should continue to run their business as well as they can, but they also need to be a positive force with the government, for the government in a sense to up their game in terms of the infrastructure. The business needs to also support the fact that taxes are going to be collected and people are going to have to pay their taxes. I mean, if we're only collecting 2 or 3% of tax revenue in non-oil sources, it means there's a lot of companies that are not paying their taxes. And I think if businesses want the country to move ahead in terms of infrastructure, in terms of security, other things they need from the government, they're going to have to pay their taxes too. So that's where we'd like to see the support from business of this going forward. I mean, right now, what we've had a situation in the past where a business can be successful, but it has to supply its own security, its own infrastructure, all of these things. It doesn't feel necessarily beholden to pay its taxes in that circumstance. That dynamic has to change.
Talk to us about this part of the report about the state of indebtedness at both the federal and state governments level. And part of your comment, that report stated that some state governments could default or could fall back on interest payments on some of the debts that they've acquired. So where does your concern lie? At the debts at the federal level or at the state level?
Well, I think at the federal level, the truth is that Nigeria is actually in good shape relative to almost every other country in the sense that its debt to GDP is very small. But it's interesting, you look at some other metrics, like the amount of the government spending that goes on interest, it's very high. Why is that? Because there's not much tax collected and because interest rates are very high, for example. But I think the federal government has a lot of headroom to be able to borrow more if it was borrowing in a wise way to help make this transition go forward. For the states, it's a slightly different situation. Some of the states have relied far too much on the oil-dependent revenue, and that amount of revenues collapsed, and they really are in a difficult situation. I think that one thing to think about is how the federal government and some of the states could work together to help them get through this transition, because the absolute amount of debt is still very small, even at the states that are having trouble. The problem is they haven't been raising much of their own IGR to be able to pay for what they need in the state.
There are very critical issues to be addressed by the Nigerian government. You talk about the structure of the economy and things like that. How do you think the new administration should proceed restructuring the petroleum sector?
Well, I think that, I mean, everyone in the country is aware of the challenges we've had with fuel scarcity in the last few weeks. And I think that one can say that having a subsidy that is difficult to administer and complex, and if not necessarily resulting in fuel getting to where it needs to, is not a workable system. So I think at this stage the administration has to think about removing the fuel subsidies. We all understand the advantage of the fuel subsidies in terms of helping certain groups with access to transportation, but I'm not sure that that's actually happening right now. So I'm sure that there's consideration about that. But at a broader level, beyond fuel, the number one issue that hampers the economy here is power. This country needs to industrialize, it should industrialize, has very large internal markets that could drive development here, but it's not possible to industrialize without access to power.
Do you think the new president should, perhaps if he holds the position as the petroleum minister, do you think that will bring accountability, transparency, anti-corruption into that critical engine of Nigeria's revenue?
Well, I think that structures have been built up in the past that necessarily aren't transparent enough for the people. I mean, at the end of the day, the petroleum resources, which are the biggest resources for the Nigerian people, need to be transparent. It needs to be clear to the people what's happening. And it's difficult to see precisely what's happening in the structure. So it has to be on the administration's agenda to step by step kind of look at that and help create that transparency. And I think that when it's transparent to everyone where the flow of funds from the petroleum, the refined products are going, it'll help immensely in the country.
So do you think, in summary, 2015, 2016 economic outlook will still be positive?
Yeah, no, we're optimistic. Our base case scenario had $55 oil. That's about the average for the year. Even at $55 oil, the economy continues to grow. We had predicted 4% for the first quarter. It came in exactly at 4%. I think if the issues around, in our view, if the issues around power in particular and security are addressed and improved, this economy won't grow at 5 or 7% like the past. It'll grow at 8 to 10%. I mean, the reality is that potential is there for a sustained period of 8 to 10% growth, given the energy of the people, the amount of resources, the amount of pent-up purchasing power. So I think we're optimistic. $65 is where oil is right now. We feel that that's a good price for Nigeria because it's low enough, it makes it clear there has to be this diversification, there has to be this increase in revenue raising at the government level, increased compliance in the tax system, but it's not so low that it creates undue stress certainly for the states. The problem is if oil does go to 45 or 35, then there really is going to have to be a lot of work, particularly at the state level, at how to navigate through to get to that diversified economy.
Okay, let's take one last question with you. The report stated that agriculture and services had sort of insulate, quote unquote, the economy from a number of shocks in recent years. How well do you think this sector have done? How much more do you think should be done? And what other sectors do you think should quickly be ramped up as well to support agri and services to lift the economy a little bit away from crude oil?
Well, 5 years ago, we coined the term world food superpower for Nigeria. We believe Nigeria should be the 5th largest producer of food in the world. And I think it's on its way. There's obviously been some increase in that. But I do know that there's, for example, if you take rice, it's still a little bit difficult for people to get their rice projects off the ground. I mean, typically they want to build a 10,000 hectare farm, have outgrowers that are in there. And a lot of projects that I see on the books are not quite there yet. So I think there needs to be some support to push those over the line in agriculture. I think in terms of another sector that's very important is the fast-moving consumer goods. All of those things can be produced here. But again, I come back to if the power situation gets better, then I think very quickly you'll find that a lot of the big, obviously the domestic ones, but also the large international players, they want to produce more in Nigeria. And I think those two sectors alone could make a big difference. Obviously banking, services, hospitality is going to be a very rapidly growing sector if there's power and if there's security. So I think we've got a broad diversification already going on here. We just need a few pillars of support from the government to make sure that it's successful over the next few years.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Andrew Nevin, the Chief Economist at PricewaterhouseCoopers, analyzing, putting perspectives on the latest PwC report on Nigeria's economy 2015-2016, navigating the rocky road ahead. We'll be right back.